Hi there. I have a little time to talk about a video that I made yesterday, actually one that I was participating in on the Modern Day Debate channel. I was in a debate with Snake, who's also known as Taylor, and we were discussing whether or not Christian morality is superior to secular morality. And I was trying to explain the whole idea by looking at our grounding and what grounds morality. And I was speaking to the fact that God grounds morality. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to offer a little bit of commentary on that particular debate yesterday. And I'm also going to try to clarify a couple of points that I was trying to make. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to share my screen with you just so you can see my key arguments. Now, my major argument was talking about God is the grounding. And so let me just get to that. Based on the premises and the conclusion that William Lane Craig has used before. And so let me get to that in just a second here. I'm just trying to get to a regular slideshow. Here we go. So we're talking about what is our foundation. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore it follows that God exists. This is the premises and the conclusion that is very logical. It's logically sound. It was put together in a slightly different format by William Lane Craig, who is a philosopher, and he has a couple of PhDs. I was questioned on that yesterday. Someone was saying he's merely an apologist. No, he's actually a philosopher with multiple PhDs. And so I was starting on this whole idea by looking at the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, this is a dilemma that was posed a few hundred years before Christ by Socrates and Plato in their book, the Euthyphro, the book, the Euthyphro. And Socrates and Plato once discovered what they determined to be a dilemma, and they used this in a way to try to pit an argument against the foundation for our objective moral values and duties. Some have used this to crack holes in God as the grounding of our objective morality. They wondered whether something is loved by the gods because he is pious, or whether it is because he is pious that he is loved by the gods. This dilemma has been subject to a variety of interpretations to posit God's relationship to our morality. Philosopher William Lane Craig has suggested this is a false dilemma, and a third option should be present, which is that God is the source of the good. In other words, our objective morality is not grounded in what may be perceived as the whims of God, made either before or after our actions. His very nature is the standard of goodness against which we align ourselves. So let's use a football analogy. That helps to better explain the concept. Imagine a football field with two teams and opposing goalposts. At one end of the field is the goalpost of the good and right, while at the other end is the goalpost of the bad and wrong. Now imagine Plato and Socrates on the field. This is a Euthyphro dilemma analogy. God instructs both to run certain plays, which are aimed to get them closer to the good goalpost. When they follow his commands, they believe he will deem their plays good. So this is the first horn of the Euthyphro. This determination is similar to define command theory, where the players would voluntarily act in accordance. However, what if Plato ran a few yards following God's instructions and then realized that God had instructed him to use different plays that varied in outcomes at other times? For this reason, this horn of the Euthyphro is often criticized for its potential to be arbitrary. Let's look at the other horn. What if God did not give Plato and Socrates instructions on the play? Instead, they ran the play they assumed to be the closest to what he would have wanted and awaited judgment. This horn also reflects a less than optimal foundation of our objective morality, because we don't know until after the action has been made whether or not God considers it good. The good and the right are not determined before and after our actions. They are shifting goalposts. So our morality is not shifting goalposts, as you see in this false dichotomy. And the shifting goalposts, as posited by Socrates and Plato, vary in unpredictable ways. Rather, God's nature forms the goalpost of the good and right and the standard against which we aim. He is the grounding of our moral foundation. Now, just to align that with my major arguments in this whole debate, Thomas Aquinas referred to Christian synderesis as the law of our mind, which is an awareness or understanding of the principles of human actions. Practical reasoning moves from one awareness of the principles to conclusions on actions or decisions. Conscience then forms a judgment on whether the actions or decisions are in alignment with one's moral nature, whether they are right or wrong. So here again, it follows with my major arguments. I looked at what C.S. Lewis said. He said, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call something crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. In other words, where did this idea of how things are supposed to be originate? We witness this at the individual level in our conscience and at the global, societal, and historical level in our collective drive over the centuries towards the goalpost of goodness. This necessarily cannot be explained at the level of human psychology, which is the argument posed by Richard Carrier, because humans are prone to evil, the other goalpost. Yet our conscience keeps driving us towards the good goalpost. Look at what Greg Kukl said. He said, the problem of evil is only a problem if evil is real. To say something is evil, though, is to make a moral judgment. Moral judgments require a moral standard or a moral law, and a moral law requires an author. If the standard is transcendent, then the lawgiver must be too. Richard Taylor says, a duty is something that is owed. So we have the moral duties to value life, liberty, justice, equity, and another number of other things, to be caring, to be kind, but something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. The concept of moral obligation is intelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. So let me get to a couple of highlights from the debate in just a moment. Okay, so let me get out of this screen. Hang on, get back over to the other screen. I see, I'm looking in the chat right now. I see John Lloyd and Praise Jesus and Slam and The Rage and all this kind of good stuff. But I just decided to come on here kind of quickly. I actually have a conference call at noon, but I wanted to make a quick commentary on part of this debate. I didn't like the very middle of the debate. So I did not like the debate between the time when Snake got done speaking up until about 44 minutes. So I've decided to exclude that portion. So here we go. I'm going to get to some of the better stuff. So, okay, 46 minutes is where I started thinking that we started to flow a little bit better. All right, so let me just get to this and hold on. Okay, so here we go. Make sure you can hear it. And all right, what kind of sound do I have? Okay, so here we go. Go back to what I think we can come to an agreement on is that's my third point is that God is the standard and the goalpost to which we're aspiring. And I want to build that off of what you said. You said the truths of reality. We should comport with the truths of reality. Why and what? What are the truths of reality? And why should we comport to that? Your statement that we should comport to the truths of reality. So what are those and why should we comport to those?
Well, I don't know how I could list all of the truths of reality. There's
well, some related to our morality. Not like a car's driving down the road. Something related to our morality.
Well, we can objectively measure what something does, right? And the fact that we can measure whether it's some kind of proposition is self-contradictory, and so to be incorrect is to be wrong, and you don't have to be right, but if you're incorrect, you're just wrong. And
see, in this particular part of the debate, I'm not sure what in the world Snake is talking about. He's not making sense to me. He's basically trying to kind of flip back to the Euthyphro. A lot of times he's talking about us judging what is good. Again, that's flipping back to the Euthyphro. He relies on that a lot. I noticed that when I reviewed a couple of his videos that he had on his own channel. So let's see if you can make sense of this. and I will get to the audience just a little bit. I'm going to ask you questions like, does this make sense to you? Because I'm trying to put together what he said. Basically, what I'm trying to do is he believes in objective morality. He has also determined that there must be some sort of a source or a foundation. And so he's decided to himself, later on in this debate, he's decided that the foundation is essentially our desire for freedom. Okay. And then he said that that is what he calls a moral imperative, categorical imperative. And then he says that the desire to seek freedom, or the things that we do to aim towards that freedom, those are all part of the system that he's built up. But it's a system that he's built up in his mind. And so I'm trying to get him to tell me what exactly is enforcing this system. And he can't come up with any sort of enforcement other than this idea that we should be rational. And this source of everything is this embedded actually in our rationality. Now, that doesn't make any sense. So let's see if we can make some sense out of this.
That's the way it is.
So, okay, so I want to go back though. If we said, if I say, I'll go back to the standards, I'll go back to a couple of the examples that we both talked about. You've mentioned genocide a few times. You mentioned the Nazis. I completely agree with you. In fact, that's one of the greatest ways to try to refute the idea of moral relativism, is saying that if we only are bound by relativistic views, no one is in a right position to be able to judge what the Nazis did if the Nazis felt what they were doing was correct within the context of their culture. And so I would say that you and I are in complete agreement on that. And this idea that what did the Nazis do was wrong. Well, number one, they violated Jewish people's lives. So they took a life unfairly and unjustly. Okay, so they were not fair, they were not just, and they basically murdered people, which is completely egregious what they did to the Jewish people in World War II. You and I and the whole world, I think, hopefully is pretty much on page with that, except for a few fringe lunatics out there. So if we look at the idea of life, justice, and liberty, we'll just mention those three because we took the Jewish people's freedom. Life, justice, we'll mention four: life, justice, freedom, and equity. So we've got four different areas that we could go from. How, if you say the truths of reality, and I'm saying that among those values are those values right there, how do we establish whether number one, how did those come about, those truths of reality under your moral framework? And then number two, how do we make people follow those if we don't have any sort of lawgiver outside of that within our own culture, because our culture could steer us wrong, as we saw in the Nazis?
Well, the lawgiver kind of seems to imply that whatever law is proposed is correct. But that's not true, because God can't propose laws that are self-contradictory and still be correct. So it's like God doesn't like certain things or does like certain things for a reason, and you can say that it's because it comports with his nature, but then that's just kicking the can down the road. Is like, okay, so why is God's nature like that? Why wouldn't God approve of genocide, and what reason could that possibly be? Why does God value justice and freedom?
See, why God values justice and freedom does not mean that God doesn't exist. It doesn't follow to say that because I have a question about something that God did on this planet, or a judgment that God's made on this planet, means that God essentially doesn't exist. See how that does not work. But he's basically coming up with some questions like, why did God do these things? Why does God have these laws? Why does he want us to do this? Why does he want us to do that? Therefore, because he has just the mere question, God must not exist. You see how that doesn't work? That's a great question. And a lot of it has to do with Genesis. Actually, it has to do with the fact that he made his first statement when he brought humans onto this planet. And he said he distinguished us from the animal world. He distinguished us from all other living forms of life. Basically said we're at the top of the totem pole. We're at the top of the food chain. And he also made us in his own image. And I think through that idea of being made in the image of God, that's given us a sense of value and importance. And he's imbued that in us through our conscience. And so I would say the reason why we know that we have these certain truths that are self-evident, and this idea that we value life, liberty, equity, and justice. And I didn't even go into equality because that's kind of a weird one. and it's weird because humans actually aren't equal, but yet we value equality of opportunities. And that's pretty amazing. And that's also, I would say, based on Tom Holland's book, a pretty nice outcome of Christianity. His book, if you haven't read it yet, is called Dominion. But my whole idea, though, with you is now, if you say, yes, these are truths, these are within us, we're going to question God on how he came to these truths. I think that you're getting a little ahead of yourself and saying, instead of questioning God, how he came to the truths, why don't you question how you came to those truths without thinking that there's any sort of force behind them? What is the force behind these truths that's compelling you to act in accordance?
Well, that's the whole point of the model, is I'm saying, how would a God do it? Because if a God is perfectly moral and perfectly good, then he must have some kind of perfect reasoning behind it. And so why would being made in his image be good? It can't be just because he's the most powerful. There has to be some inherent value in whatever his nature and the creations that are modeled after him.
It's almost like he's trying to figure out who God is and put God together in his mind, because a lot of what he's saying actually completely is true. I mean, God is the source of our rationality. God is the source of our moral system. God is the reason why we feel guilty and we feel shame when we do the wrong thing and we treat our fellow humans in inhumane ways, we do something incorrect. And God is the source of that little gnawing in your ear. If you lie to somebody, if you cheat somebody, if you don't tell the truth, essentially that is what God does. He basically tries to set us straight. And thank God for that, because imagine if we didn't have that sort of thing and we were on this planet without any sort of divine moral lawgiver to whom we should be held accountable.
And it's just self-referential to say that, well, he's good, therefore his traits are good. There has to be some kind of thing outside of that where, okay, he's good because he's not making any mistakes or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the, going back a little bit to Jesus and talking about what happened when he came about, is we had these confusions. We had Aristotle and Plato, and no, it's Plato and Socrates basically going back and forth on the Euthyphro, trying to figure out exactly if God's good, God's this, God's it. Everyone's trying to figure out what the gods are doing. And at that time, it was the gods. They were trying to figure out exactly what that meant. And so you enter Jesus, and he's saying, okay, here's what's going on. I'm the standard. I am the bread of life. I am the one who's basically going to guide you into heaven. And act like him, act in accordance. And so we saw the example of what we need to be like through him. And ever since then, this whole idea that we used to, but prior to that, women were given barely any value in society. This idea of life was sort of a joke. They left women to die on the streets. They were in the Roman Empire. Women were treated pretty horribly. Babies, a lot of times, especially female babies, were left just to rot, or they were exposed because they weren't valued like they are today. The poor and weak were considered cursed by God. And so what was really neat was that suddenly Jesus comes about and the Christians turn around over the first few hundred years during a time of heavy persecution, sporadic heavy persecution over these first few hundred years. The Christians turned around and said, wait a second, we should really value everybody. Let's get these people out of the Colosseums and away from these gladiatorial battles and being fed to the lions and those sorts of things. The Christians stopped that. And the Christians said, you know what? Right now, only the soldiers are giving hospital care, and definitely not the poor people or anybody like that. The Christians started taking people in and adopting these little babies out in the streets. And the Christians, if you read a lot of this on Tom Holland's book, but there's some other books by other people like Alvin Schmidt that talk a lot about our history and what happened. And you get to the time where suddenly the Christians are the ones creating all of these great universities, medical facilities, and that's carried us up till today. And if you look at the United States, we're founded really on a Christian heritage in this idea of equality, despite the fact that we have differing inputs. We've got smarter people. We have people with more athletic ability. We have people with more physical capabilities. We've got men and women are in differing strengths, all that kind of stuff. But yet somehow we value this idea of equality of opportunity, which is a complete anomaly from anything that was in existence prior to Jesus. And so I would make a pretty big argument that the source of our Christian morality and the source of morality altogether, especially the one that's steeped in Western values and Western civilization, and from which all of the other civilizations around the planet have been benefiting and starting to benefit. We're seeing right now with Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago allowing women finally to drive a car. And so we can see that some of the values that we hold to be self-evident, we hold to be true, have gone into the other parts of the planet. And the plan is that it's going to spread all throughout the planet. And that'll, when we finally get to that point, we'll get to where the end of the world comes and we'll be called up. And so that's my bottom line. I want to build off that just a little bit, and I want to make a couple of points. So one of the things is people trying to understand exactly what was going on prior to the time when Jesus walked on the planet. And so prior to that time, God was essentially working his way. God had built a path in the Old Testament. He had carved a pathway for Jesus to arrive. And what he did was he chose a certain people, the Jewish people, and he led them out of exile, out of Egypt. It actually says, even in the Bible, out of Egypt, I call my son. And of course, we know that Jesus, when he was a baby, did spend a little time in Egypt. It also says in the Bible that we expect that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem, which he was, of course. It also says in the Bible that Jesus in Isaiah 9:6 is going to be called the Prince of Peace. He's going to be Emmanuel, and that's God with us. And of course, Jesus is with us. And in the Old Testament, we also see Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and Zechariah 12:10, which actually pointed to the exact means by which Jesus would be killed. So they talked about him being pierced. In Isaiah 53, he's pierced for our transgressions. He's crushed for our iniquities. So during this period of time, prior to the time when Jesus came, we had what Psalm 82 and what Michael Heiser has referred to as a number of sons of God on the planet who had been given a divine place, essentially. So if you go back and you look at Deuteronomy 32 and you look at the Tower of Babel, you're going to see that God relinquished or gave some of his authority to them, these sons of God, which were essentially spiritual beings, way less than his kind of power, just spiritual beings, not true gods. They were sons of God, and they were given powers and authorities over different principalities in the world. And what Jesus did is he reclaimed those. Okay, he came back, and if we go back to the Tower of Babel, we'll see that 70 different lands or provinces were given authorities under these. Jesus came back and sent his disciples out over the same 70 provinces. You'll notice that Paul says to go out to Spain. He's mentioning Spain in particular because that was the last outpost. They had already covered all of the other areas in the ancient Near East, and he knew that he needed to still go to Spain to reach these people and to basically say that Jesus had come, and Jesus's time, the Messiah's time, is right now. Now, what you may not realize is that the Jewish people were expecting the Messiah during this exact time period. Okay, that's why there were multiple people claiming to be the Messiah right around this time. And those were pointed out by Gamaliel, for example, in Acts 5. People at that time were expecting a Messiah because, or I should say, it's been recorded in some ancient Jewish works, but it was also recorded later on by the Sanhedrin in 97a, 97b, 98a, 98b. They knew that there were two types of kings that were expected. There was going to be one lowly and riding on a donkey, and you can have the reference, of course, to Zechariah 9:9. We also had the type of king who would be coming in the clouds of heaven, and we have the reference from Daniel 7. And the Jewish people wrote in those Sanhedrin that I just cited, they wrote that they expected two different types. They didn't know what type Jesus was going to be. And so we do have Jesus, of course, coming in this lowly means, a man of little power monetarily or anything like that. He was rubbing elbows with the poorest, the meekest, the most humble. He essentially exalted the poor, the meek, the humble. Women were the ones to discover the empty tomb. He did everything that had been predicted of him. He fulfilled over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament, which is pretty much miraculous in itself. And then what he did was he went back again in the Pentecost. He essentially gave his disciples the powers to reclaim the lands from those other spirits who have been dwelling there. Now, what's going on with the spirits today? Well, unfortunately, the spirits are still on this planet wreaking havoc in some ways because they essentially don't think that they don't want to relinquish their power, although they do know that the end is near, and they made that clear. We heard, of course, in the Gospels when Jesus interacted with some of these demon spirits and these other spirits that were there. So we have that sort of thing. So let me go back to, actually I want to go to this point 109 that I think that's where it was. Maybe it's 104. So let's go right here and just see what else we can build on here to make more of a case for Christianity and the Christian values. Essentially, the bottom line is the big problem with this idea of secular humanity is, one, first, they've smuggled in Christian values. They've taken all of our values. They love the idea that we value things like trust, honesty, all this sort of things, but even equality of opportunities, okay? The Western values, the things that were not in place in many other societies and are still not in place today in other societies that are not steeped in Western values. For example, if you go into Chinese society, they hardly give people equal opportunities. It's not something that a value that they necessarily exalt. If you go into the Indian societies, of course, people still know which caste that they were born in. Even though they've outlawed caste, they still know which caste they belong to because that's been passed down from generation to generation. So these, of course, differences, hierarchical differences between people. And of course, if you go into the Arab cultures, look at how women are still being treated today. Okay, just consider the fact that they just got the right to drive a car in Saudi Arabia. To me, that's pretty crazy. But according to Muhammad, women have only half the brains of men. Now, of course, that is fundamentally completely untrue, I should say. And here's why we know that that's untrue. We know when they do average IQ tests and they look at IQ tests across the planet, essentially, women and men both score on average about 100. Okay, that means that, guess what? We're not scoring half the IQ of a man. And so that is completely ridiculous. So the bottom line is, under this secular morality and this system, what I was trying to get Snake to tell me is, who's the authority? To whom are we bound? Where do these laws come from, these moral laws, if not a moral lawgiver? okay, a transcendent moral lawgiver. We know that if we have these moral laws that have been passed down through societies, we know that if we have that it's that there must be a source that also is transcendent to our societies, times, eras, and people and cultures. Okay, so the thing is, we've been discovering this sort of thing. Now, I was asked a question a little bit later on in this debate. Somebody asked me about some of the stuff that happened in the Old Testament. And so Snake made several references to biblical slavery in the Old Testament. Okay, so he mentioned that a couple of times. I want to point out something that's going on. When Yahweh was essentially the theological authority over Israel in the ancient times, they had different means of punishing people for breaking the law. They talked about, well, why would God say that people had to be stoned back then? Well, because they didn't have something like the electric chair as they have today. So we have a different means of punishment. Does it mean that they had different cultural values? Well, yes, they did have some different cultural values. There is cultural relativism to an extent, but there's also objective morality. Some people try to say there's only cultural relativism. Now, I would not make that claim. I'm saying that there is cultural relativism. Some cultures have values that are relative to their own cultures, but there's also an objective morality that we all share, that are universal, no matter what country you're from. We have this innate sense in our conscience to value life, liberty, justice, equity, and I could go on. Okay, so a lot of those different kind of values came about. God has put those in our minds essentially, but Christianity really helped to highlight those views, especially the value of the individual. So when we talk about things going on in the Old Testament and somebody says, oh, if I'm going to judge what happened in the Old Testament, then a lot of times you tell them they can't be a person who only thinks that cultural relativism exists. Okay, because if they're going to judge something in those Old Testament times, they have to put on that relative sense. Now, for me, with the objective morality, I say, well, what happened in the Old Testament? Is it wrong by today's standards? Well, today's standards are the same as the Old Testament standards as far as life, liberty, justice. However, the laws that God had set, the sorts of punishments that he had set under his guidance under Israel, were Mosaic laws, and Jesus fulfilled those laws. And so some of the laws that God sent basically are put aside and replaced when Jesus fulfilled the laws with the new covenant. Okay, so Jesus did that for us. And essentially Jesus set about new laws. The two major laws that we have to agree: love the Lord above all else and love your neighbors as yourselves. And you can't go wrong with something like that. And so let's listen to, I think it's at 104.
Do you mean like at what point are we justified in basically making people obey the ethic?
How can you convince somebody under a system like yours that your system is correct when it's something that you're telling them, hey, we've got these truths of reality, and they say, well, those aren't my truths of reality. How do you convince them that your moral ontological position, that these truths exist, they're self-evident, they're axiomatic? How would you convince somebody of that under a system such as yours?
Well, the same way a God should. Like a God shouldn't be saying, well, it's true because otherwise I'll punish you. That's not a good enough reason. A God should be saying it's true because X and X and X, because these premises are sound and therefore this conclusion that I've come to is correct. And so rationality is this.
See, what he's doing right now is he's trying to put God and bring him down to the planet and give him human attributes. And so he's trying to say that God has to explain himself. God has to look at the rules that are set and listen to the rules and obey the rules. That's one of his chief arguments, which is pretty ridiculous, really. I mean, God is the source and the foundation of the rules. Okay, so God doesn't have to obey rules that he has that are innate within him. They are his structure. They are part of his nature. Okay, the value of life, because we're made in God's image. It's something that's with us. And so here we go.
External value that we base things on. And you don't have to accept God's authority. You don't have to accept rationality. You don't even have to accept an army coming at you over the hill. You can choose to fight back and maybe you'll even win, but that doesn't justify your actions. So rationality is above governments, and I would argue even above, if not just beside God. Governments have been reformed because of rational movements like abolishing monarchy and freedom of choice, freedom of property, and anti-slavery. And I think similarly, God has this external authority by which he can justify his actions. And I don't.
So it's one of the things when a person is a secular humanist and they value objective morality to keep talking about God and what God does, because I think deep down, Snake actually does have a pretty good sense that there is a God, there is a divine authority, there's someone who's in power, and there's a lawgiver. Okay. And it's a really good thing. I mean, we should really appreciate this as humans, because imagine if he did what the deists hope he did. The deists aren't actually thinking through their position. The deists believe, and that's DEISTS, the deists believe that God created the whole universe. Okay. He created it and then he left. Then he checked out. Okay. He created it from a transcendent position and then he decided to check out. Okay. That's not what God did. God is actually both immanent, which is within the universe, and transcendent to the universe. Okay. That is another way that Christianity is distinguished from other faiths. So people who are pantheistic basically means everything is God, pan, everything, all. Okay, so this idea of being pantheistic, they essentially think that the whole planet is sort of imbued with God. God is part of nature here on the planet, and God is immanent. That's what they believe. But they don't believe that God is also transcendent to the universe. What the pantheists believe, in a lot of these different Eastern faiths, they believe that the universe is a constant sense of recycling. Okay, so in other words, their beliefs are not in alignment with what we found around 1925 with the Big Bang. The Big Bang essentially says time, space, and matter had a start date. Okay, so we have to know that what came before the start date had to be immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, essentially God. But we also know what had to come before the start date, also had to have the desire to have a start date. Okay, the desire to create the universe, had to have the ability, so had to be very powerful, had to be very intentional because the universe was created. So there was an intention there. Okay, so we know that had to precede the Big Bang. And so if you take a look at what logically follows is that those are the characteristics of God. God logically follows just from the Big Bang. Okay, God logically follows if we look at our design. If we look at the fact that we have 3.5 billion nucleotides that are well ordered, A, C, G, and T, well ordered within our system, within a cell, okay, we know from the human genome that there had to be a coder for this code, okay? So just even looking at that, and just to think about how that works, I've used this example before, and I'm using a little bit from John Lennox, but he says, what if you went to the beach and you saw the words, I love you written in the sand? Would you assume that no mind was behind that? The same way, what if you looked at our human genome and you see 3.5 billion well-ordered letters, okay? 3.5 billion, and are you gonna actually assume that there's no designer and no coder when you look at a code like that? It's pretty ridiculous. It's on the level of assuming that the Bible just wrote itself, just splat down, jumped onto the map and wrote itself. And the same thing is going with the universe. The universe just bang, formed itself. And in all of its intelligibility, in all of its logic, in all of the rationality, in all of the reasoning, in everything that we see on this world and this consciousness, essentially, in our human conscience, in everything that we see, we should be able to see that there's a divine power behind it. And my God, we should be thankful. We should be really thankful for that. So let's go to, I'm going to go to one of these questions here. So let's get to this. It views individuals as all of value.
Well, gotcha. I think it's translated as slave because it says slaves are your property. So,
got to give SJ the last word on this, just because the super chat was originally a challenge to her, and then we got to move to the next one.
Yeah, actually, and I'm just realizing Ebed would have been used in that's the Old Testament. That was the Hebrew word. I actually am not, I shouldn't have mentioned that word, but the translations coming in from the Old Testament talking about slavery back then initially were coming from the word Ebed. And then in the New Testament, obviously it was written in Greek. And so it was whatever the Greek word was. Let me build on that. He had asked a question about slavery in the Bible. And so a lot of atheists use this reasoning. They say, because God didn't stop slavery in the Bible, that means that God must not exist. He must be logically incoherent because he's a loving God. Slavery is bad. Therefore, God should have stopped slavery in the Bible. And therefore, God must not exist, must be bad. If he does exist, he's an evil force. Now, that doesn't make sense. Number one, here's a bunch of facts to think about if you're arguing with an atheist on this particular point. Number one, I can see my husband's getting out into the car. Sorry for the distraction. Number one, you have this idea of the ancient Near East. And in many other places in the world, slavery formed the foundations of their economic systems. it was like a video game back then. I look at what my kids do where they're plundering other people's areas in these Minecraft and these other videos. They're going around plundering and taking from other societies. Essentially, that was what the ancient Near East looked like. So societies, to build themselves up, would have to go conquer other societies, take their gold, bring it back, and enslave the people who were in those societies. That's just what societies did back in those times. And people lived in a very impoverished circumstance, almost in all cases, with very few exceptions. So there wasn't this huge middle class like we have today that's operating in a very abundant sense. We had a lower class, which was just about everybody, and then we had a handful of kings and queens. Okay, so that's how society was operating back then. And so to gain power as a king and a queen, you had to take over other people's lands. And when they did that again, they formed slavery. So what God did is God essentially said, I'm going to regulate your system. Okay, I'm going to tell you that you need to treat people right. You're not allowed to just go beat people, go kill people, go do that kind of stuff. And if a slave should escape, guess what? He didn't say go back and catch him like is what we had in the antebellum time. If a slave escaped, it was illegal here in the United States, and you had to return him to the master. And a lot of times the master would beat him and do all kinds of things to him. Okay, if a slave escaped back in those times, the Israelites were told to take that slave in and take care of the slave. In other words, if a slave was having a bad time with his master, he or she were told to go, you can escape, and they're going to have to take care of you if you do. So basically, God set about a bunch of regulations. Now, does that mean that he condoned slavery? He appreciated, he exalted? No. Just as God created laws for people during Moses' time who wanted to get a divorce. Okay, Moses said it was okay to get a divorce, but it wasn't because God liked divorce or God was condoning divorce. He hates divorce. Okay, if we go to what Jesus said in the New Testament, he said, you people were very hardened. Your hearts were hardened. You were a difficult, stiff people. So essentially, when you begged God to be able to divorce your wives, God said it was okay under certain circumstances to divorce your wives. And the same thing Jesus said. He said there's one case where if the wife or the husband, one of the persons is cheating on the other one, in that case, divorce is permitted. In these other cases, you're pretty much an adulterer, okay, if you're divorced and you get remarried. And so he frowns on that. Does that mean he condones it? No. So go back and place that same exact argument on the slavery thing. Okay, so basically slavery was around in the Old Testament. It was part of the history, it's part of the times, and that's one of the reasons why we saw that sort of thing. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay, here we go.
Gotcha. And thanks for your question. This one comes in from Cosmic QQ. Says, question for SJ, how can a God that committed a worldwide genocide with the flood be a standard for morality?
We have to remember something that's really important is God basically is the creator of all life on the planet. And so it goes back to something that Aquinas said. Aquinas basically said that as the creator of the planet, he's the one who sets the start date and the end dates for everybody here. And he does it with his morally sufficient reasoning that's going to ensure and maximize people's better existence in the next life. And so he decided that the planet was corrupt, and he saved a few people, Noah and his group. And he realized the rest of the planet would be better off not living in this corrupt earth and instead going into the afterlife and waiting until the time of judgment. He realized the corruption was just too much, and it was worse probably to be here on the earth than it would be to be in the afterlife. I want to get to one final point here. I want to make something about 1 Samuel 15, because a lot of us have, as apologists or as Christians, we've faced people who've been challenged or who've thought that 1 Samuel 15 is something that we just can't get past. Now, in 1 Samuel 15, essentially God had ordered the Israelites to take the men, women, and children of another group of people who had been committing various sins. Okay, so God decided in his morality, with his divine providence, with his divine knowledge of their potential and their future and the fact of what they were contributing to the earth and whether or not it would be good for these people to remain on the earth, or whether or not he should put them into the afterlife, essentially. People don't like when I say change locations, but that's a lot of what happened in the Old Testament. So when we had a society like Canaan that had worshiped gods like Molech and Baal, we've got Molech and Baal. Molech and Baal were these awful looking gods. If you look at the old statues, they look like some sort of animal god. And they had their hands in sort of a position where it was out in front. So they had like a bowl in front of their hand. Well, the Canaanites thought that if they worshipped Baal, their crops would be better. And they thought that if they sacrificed their children, and there have been many bodies unearthed of children, babies between the ages of pretty much infants to 4 years old, inside of buildings and all sorts of different places where they were sacrificing their children. And what they would do to sacrifice them is they didn't kill them out front, they burned them to death. And apparently they would beat drums really, really loudly back then so that people would not hear the cries of the babies who were burning in sacrifice to these horrible gods. Now, just to get a picture of how horrible these gods were, is these gods were committing bestiality, they were incestuous, they exalted this idea of sex with all kinds of different people and animals, everything else. They were really awful. Okay, so the morals of the gods were so bad. So the people in emulating their gods, of course, would emulate those morals. So when God ordered the destruction of that entire people, especially because there would be blood retribution, if he didn't order the destruction of the entire people, what that means is the kids as they grew up would realize their position and would go back and kill the people who'd killed the families. But that was part of blood retribution, was part of the past. So what happened was God decided it'd be better that these people no longer occupy the earth because they're wreaking havoc on the earth and it's a pure hell for anyone in that existence. And it would be better for them to be in the abyss essentially and to wait judgment. And when they come out at judgment and judgment day, the ones who revered God and the ones who revered Jesus and the ones who move that way, move forward, would be put into heaven. And so if you would appreciate heaven, it's open to everybody. A lot of times people say, oh, I'm not ready to come to Jesus. I've had people say that a lot. They say they accept God, they accept the Bible, but they really don't want to come to Jesus quite yet. They're not ready to come to Christianity quite yet. They're not ready to say Jesus is Lord and go get baptized yet. Why they do that in some cases is because they feel like they're sinners. They feel like they're not worthy. But on one of my final notes today is I want to say everyone is worthy. Look who Jesus hung out with, okay? The prostitutes, the downtrodden, the tax collectors. Nobody liked tax collectors back then. He hung out with all kinds of people of ill repute and essentially figured out a way to make them better. He always said, go forth and sin no more, that sort of thing. Go forth and do none of those actions again. He said that to the woman who was the adulteress. He said that to the woman at the well. He essentially said that to other people. He basically scolded the Pharisees for some of the ways they exalted themselves, and he elevated the people who were the poorest. And if you are really wondering if you're worthy of him, think about the thief on the cross next to him. His whole life was probably pretty bad, okay? He's probably going around stealing from people and doing pretty bad things along with the other thief. But the difference between the two thieves is one of them in one of his last moments turned to Jesus and wanted to be with Jesus in his kingdom. And Jesus said, today you will be with me in the kingdom. Now, if people say, well, how can that happen? He said, today you'll be with me in the kingdom. And we know that Jesus, when he died, then he went down for 3 days. He was going down into the earth and basically unsealing people from their sins, freeing people from their sins and the binds of sin, and bringing them into heaven. We know that was over a 3-day period. But remember, heavenly days aren't the same as our sort of days. Remember that God is outside of time. Going back to what we talked about with the cosmological argument, God is the timeless, spaceless, immaterial form that was present before all of us, obviously before the universe. And so going back to that, his time is not the same as ours. He doesn't operate under linear time. So if Jesus says in this day, it's in heavenly time, which again is transcendent to our sort of time. So I've got about 9 more minutes before I have to get ready for a conference call. It obviously takes place at 12 o'clock, my time, Eastern. So I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, thoughts, ideas. I don't know if you watched the debate last night, but that was what I was starting off here. If you just joined, that's what I was reviewing here. It's a portion of that debate. It's trying to go back to mention what a source of our objective moral values and duties are. If you're in the audience and you question whether we have objective moral values and duties, ask yourself, do you value life? Okay. That's the basic. Do you value life? Meaning, do you value your life, your kids' lives, your parents' lives, your loved ones' lives? Do you value people who are even strangers? When you see someone who's killed, when you saw that atrocious thing that happened to the Black gentleman up in Minnesota, you realize, and the reason we all called out is because we know that was morally wrong. It was morally abhorrent. We value the life of the innocent, and we valued the life when we saw that sort of a thing. Okay. And we value love, we value liberty, we value equity, we value justice. So we have these foundational values to which we all aspire. We're in a process of discovering what it's like to be more like Jesus. And that's everything that Jesus did to bring us there. So that is a good thing. And so I'm looking, I see Jesse camping, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on in this conversation here. It says the Bible shows God knew it from Genesis chapter 3. I'm trying to see where I missed something of what we're talking about. God knew the flood would fail. Yeah, God knew. God is omnipresent. Okay. A lot of people also have this idea. I'll just mention another last thing. God has this idea that if we have free will, then free will is a direct contradiction to God's omniscience. But it's not, because God is concurrently in our past, present, and future. So we have free will, but God knows what we will do, because again, God is outside of time. He's already seen us do it. He's already seen us live out our lives. He's already seen all the decisions we're going to make. And he knows, and I have this Molinistic kind of position, he knows what we will, what we would, and what we could do under varying circumstances. So there was a time when David had talked to God in the Old Testament, and he said something like, if I go here, what will Saul do? And God answered that he knew that Saul would do something in particular. I think it was to kill David if David went into this one area. He knew what Saul's actions would be under certain circumstances. So David decided not to make the decision to go there, because he knew what Saul would do under that circumstance. That falls in line with the Molinist position. So it's not a failed plan. Who's saying, did it fail? I'm trying to figure out where we're coming in here. Oh, so people think a contradiction in the Bible might occur because people didn't act in accordance with the way God wanted them to act. And we did see that. We see that every single day in our sinful nature. Okay. So one of the things that we do is we try to act in accordance with God. He knows how we're going to act. He knows how he's going to have to rebuild humanity. He knows the lessons he's going to have to show humanity. He showed us with the flood the lesson that if people are going to act in morally abhorrent ways, that there will be punishment, essentially. He will wage punishment on people for acting in egregious ways. And so that's what he did. And just to get another idea, a lot of people think, oh, why would God do such a thing? Why would God commit genocide? God didn't commit genocide. God basically decided that people were going to have to be punished for their sins. And one of the reasons he did that is look at how Sodom and Gomorrah was and what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah. We know that people were going around raping visitors in Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you just walked into the town of Sodom or Gomorrah and you were walking around as a visitor, they would actually capture you, rape you, and that was the way that they welcomed people. Okay, that right there is the bottom line of how morally egregious that Sodom and Gomorrah had come. But people say, well, what about the innocent people? Well, actually, we see in the Bible instances where if there were morally just people, morally upright people, God would actually wait until they left or they passed away or until a different generation before going in there and deciding to enact and punish these people for doing incorrect things. And I want to say hi to Utopia Buster and Jesse Camping and Clara and Charlie Reed. I actually saw Utopia Buster, your really long message. It was a very nice message. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I also want to say thank you to Slam. Yes, you can't imagine what the world would be like without Christianity. A really beautiful thing and a sort of secret that people don't know is Tom Holland is a Christian. Okay, he was an agnostic. He started studying the history of Christianity in his book Dominion. He looked over the past 2,000 years. He saw what Christianity's done. And he told a person that I've talked to, and I can't say the person's name, but he told somebody I've talked to that he is a Christian. And I've heard him publicly say it now, that he identifies as a Christian. So he's making steps closer to Jesus. So once you realize the beauty and the way that Jesus has transformed our society and what he's done, you come to Christianity. So as a final note, I keep saying final note, and then I have one more note, but I wanted to say, just take a look at how is it possible that a person who was born to such humble circumstances as Jesus, who was in this little teeny area in the ancient Near East, who was of humble means, who hung around fishermen, who hung around people of low repute and other people like that. How is it possible that somebody like that, by the year 313, when Constantine finally legalized Christianity, how is it possible that by then, according to secular historians, between 5 and 6 million people were worshiping Jesus? Okay, how is it possible if Jesus didn't have a divine power that was working through so many of those people and bringing people to Christianity through the many miracles started off with Peter and Paul in the book of Acts and going through the books of the Bible? We have someone of very humble circumstances. As Gamaliel said in Acts 5, if these men are not led by God, this will die out, just as the others died out. Okay, Theudas, he pointed out some other people who said that they were the Savior, Vespasian, a lot of these other people, their movements died out. However, if it is powered by God, if God is behind this whole movement, you won't be able to stop Christianity. Today, we have about 2.4 billion Christian adherents around the world. That is the largest religion there is. It's followed by the Muslim faith, which has 1.9 billion adherents. Now, let's take a look at the parallels between the Muslim faith and the book of Revelation. Okay, take a look at the parallels between what they call the Mahdi and the book of Revelation. They actually have a similar idea about the end times. Okay. And so their Antichrist is a Christ, our Christ. Our Antichrist is their Mahdi. And if that isn't exciting, I don't know what is. But we also know which one's going to win. And so be thankful, be blessed, and everyone have a wonderful day. I'm so glad you guys all came by. I've got a conference call to get on with my nonprofit group, one of the last few. I'm stepping down from being past president of this particular nonprofit group in experiential education in September. So I won't be as busy in that way. So I'm probably going to even be making more videos. I also have a sabbatical coming up next spring. So guess what? I'm going to do some really cool stuff for Christianity at that time. So thank you, everybody, for stopping by. Please like, subscribe, do come again. And remember, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through the Son.